You will probably scream a lot, and that is exactly what I want you to do. It's what turns me on.
She was completely naked. Dirt and covered her skin, and ran across her arms and legs. A heavy metal collar was locked around her neck, with a chain dangling from it that hit the ground each time she stumbled forward. Anyone who saw her would have thought she was running from something that wasn't finished with her yet. She headed straight toward the closest house, breaking into short, desperate pleas for someone to answer. The man who opened the door froze. She was standing there trembling, covered in injuries, and struggling to catch her breath. The homeowner pulled her inside and called 911, not yet realizing that the woman standing in his living room had just escaped something far more calculated and brutal than a single attack. Within hours, investigators followed her account back to a small property only a short distance away. And once they stepped inside, they understood why she had run the way she did, and why she looked the way she did. What they found inside that trailer didn't just uncover a crime, it exposed something built over years, something organized, methodical, and designed to break people in ways most officers had never imagined. And her escape was the first crack in a case that would become one of the darkest in New Mexico's history. This is the story of David Parker Ray, the infamous toy box serial killer and his Satan's Den of Horror. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Cynthia Vigil had been working the streets of Albuquerque the night she met David Parker Ray, and she thought she was stepping into a normal transaction. But the moment she climbed into his camper, everything shifted. He pulled out a police badge and told her she was under arrest. And before she could even finish saying he wasn't a real officer, Cindy Hendy appeared from behind her and drove a stun gun into her back. The shock dropped her long enough for the cuffs to snap around her wrists, and by the time she realized she couldn't move, Ray was already telling her to stay quiet. He forced her to undress inside the camper while Cindy watched her closely, and then they pulled a hood over her head, cutting off her vision and any sense of where she was being taken. When they stepped away from her, she heard a cassette click into place, and a man's voice came through the speakers, calm and rehearsed, speaking as if he had said the same words to many women before her. "Hello there, fuck. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances." The voice kept going, explaining her situation with an ease that made her stomach twist. "You will be thoroughly and repeatedly in every hole you've got, because basically you've been snatched and brought here for us to train you to use as a... You're going to be kept naked and chained up like an animal, to be used in anytime we want to, any way that we want to." From that moment on, Cynthia was plunged into a timeline of that felt endless. Many of them won't be recounted because of how graphic they are, and you shouldn't watch this video near children, please. Ray inserted large devices into her, and he attached metal clamps to her, connecting them to a generator that sent shocks through her body every time he flipped the switch. He forced her legs open with a separator bar and smeared gravy inside her, and then he brought in a dog and let it lick her while he and Cindy watched. When she thought she couldn't take any more, Ray used a barbed dildo on her until she lost consciousness. This went on until Monday morning, when Ray left for work as if nothing unusual had happened, and Cindy was left to watch Cynthia alone. But she wasn't nearly as disciplined or careful, and most of her attention stayed glued to the soap operas playing on the living room television. Before Ray left, he had removed Cynthia's wrist restraints, leaving only the metal collar locked to a ring on the wall, and at some point during the day, Cindy set the keys on the table and forgot about them. Cynthia noticed immediately, and she knew this was the only moment she might ever get, so she stretched her leg toward the table, inch by inch, until her foot hooked the edge and pulled it slowly toward her. She grabbed the keys, unlocked the chain from the wall, and moved as quietly as her shaking body allowed. She reached the phone and dialed 911, but before she could speak, Cindy walked in and screamed, "You're not going anywhere," then smashed a glass lamp over Cynthia's head. The hit stunned her, but it didn't drop her, and Cynthia grabbed the nearest object she could reach and struck Cindy back, knocking her down long enough to run out the front door. She sprinted barefoot and naked down the road, dragging the heavy collar and chain, until she reached the mobile home where she begged the owner to help her. The police were called immediately, and Ray and Cindy tried to flee the moment they realized she had escaped, but officers stopped them on the road and arrested them that same day. Cynthia was safe, but what investigators were about to find inside that trailer would prove she was only one of many, and her escape wasn't just survival, it was the beginning of an entire case collapsing in on the man who had built the world she ran from. When officers entered David Parker Ray's property after Cynthia's escape, they expected to find the scene of an assault, but they did not expect to find an entire setup that looked like it had been engineered for one purpose and perfected over years. Against one wall stood a full gynecological table with metal stirrups, and above it was a large mirror mounted to the ceiling so that whoever was strapped down had no choice but to watch themselves the entire time, and officers immediately understood this was psychological built into the room. Around the table were leg spreaders, medical clamps, scalpels, ropes, pulleys, and an array of restraints that were organized by type, and none of it appeared dusty or unused, which made the room feel active even though it was empty. Then officers noticed a long, coffin-like box pushed against another wall, and when they opened it, they found it lined with fur, with multiple eye bolts attached from the inside so a person could be secured tightly and left with no way to move, and the setup was clearly designed for prolonged confinement rather than momentary restraint. Along another wall were electrical devices wired with clamps and cables that matched Cynthia's description of and near them were a series of hand-built tools Ray had named himself, including a vaginal stretcher and a knee spreader, which looked like something between a medical invention and a weapon. Camera mounts were positioned neatly throughout the room so every angle of the table and the confinement box could be recorded, and above one mount was a sign in bold letters that said, "Satan's Den," which officers assumed was what he called the space. Another sign nearby read, "A woman will do or say anything to get loose," and the way it was placed suggested it was meant as a reminder to himself rather than a decoration. As they searched the rest of the trailer, they found a collection of more than 100 videotapes and photographs stacked in boxes and drawers, and many of the images showed women in restraints that matched the equipment in the room. Some photographs revealed faces clearly, including one that matched the missing woman, Kelly Van Cleve, and investigators realized immediately that Cynthia wasn't an isolated victim, but part of a pattern that might stretch back years. But that's not all. They also found Ray's journals, written in his own hand, describing abductions and experiments on victims he never named, and some entries suggested he had taken more than 60 women over time. Because the trailer was so complex and contained so much evidence, the FBI transported it intact to their office in Santa Fe, and they assigned Special Agent Patty Rust to catalog everything inside. She entered the trailer day after day and documented every tool as she moved through the room slowly because she wanted the record to be exact. So, she spent 5 days inside that trailer, and when her work was finally done, she stepped outside, walked a short distance away from the structure, and shot herself with her service weapon. She died instantly. Although the FBI later stated that her suicide was not linked to the evidence she saw inside the toy box, they only noted that she had been the person who spent the most time inside Ray's room, and she never spoke about what she felt while she worked there. Before investigators understood the scale of what they had uncovered in Elephant Butte, they needed to understand who had built the room they were standing in, and the story led them back to 1939, when David Parker Ray was born in Belen, New Mexico, into a home marked by instability and alcohol. His father, Cecil Ray, drifted in and out of the house and was known for drinking heavily and fighting, and because the family couldn't stay afloat financially, David and his younger sister Peggy were sent to live with their grandparents in Mountain Air, where life became rigid and punitive. The grandparents were strict Christians who believed discipline should come fast and without much explanation, and the children learned early that almost anything could earn a beating. David struggled socially, and school never offered much relief because he was shy around girls and often bullied for it, and this made him even more withdrawn. And by the time he was 13, David spent his free time drawing women tied up, restrained, or and he kept the drawings hidden until the day his sister found them spread across his room. When she asked him what the drawings meant, he brushed it off, saying it was just a hobby. But the reaction from his sister created a distance between them, and the tension never eased, because she knew she had seen something that didn't feel like ordinary teenage curiosity. After graduating high school, David enlisted in the Army, and he worked as a mechanic where he learned to repair small, precise equipment like watches, radios, and telescopes, and those skills later showed up in the design of his devices. He married for the first time in 1959, but the marriage collapsed quickly. After the divorce, he remarried, then divorced again in less than a year. One of his marriages produced his daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray, but even fatherhood didn't anchor him, and by the late 1960s, he had drifted through various jobs and states. However, during those years, several women in his orbit disappeared in ways that were never proven to involve him, but raised questions later. One of them was a teenage girl named Sally, who disappeared while traveling with him after he told their hosts she was a free spirit who had moved on. There was no investigation at the time, and no one challenged his explanation. His fantasies escalated, and he later admitted that by the 1970s, he couldn't climax during self-pleasure unless he imagined killing a woman. He eventually returned to New Mexico and settled near Elephant Butte, where he took a job with the New Mexico Parks Department as a maintenance worker, which gave him easy access to remote areas and long stretches of unsupervised time. Over the next several years, he used his paychecks, his mechanical training, and his ability to fabricate custom equipment to build what would later be called the Toy Box. The location gave him everything he needed: privacy and a body of water deep enough to hide anything he didn't want found. By the time Cynthia escaped and exposed what he had been doing, the Toy Box was fully developed and filled with equipment that matched his earliest fantasies from childhood. Investigators knew David Parker Ray didn't operate alone because Cynthia's escape made it clear that another set of hands had restrained her, and when detectives followed the timeline backward, they found 3 people who had been directly involved in different stages of his crimes, each drawn into his life in a way that made their participation possible and eventually routine. The first was his daughter, Jessie Ray, who had grown up inside David's contradictions and learned early that her father's interests weren't normal, even by strict mountaineer standards, and she had seen enough to understand exactly what he was capable of. When she was a teenager, she walked in on one of his bondage sessions and watched a sex worker flee the house naked after he took things too far, and the moment unsettled her so deeply that she went to the FBI in 1986 and reported that her father had been kidnapping and torturing women before taking them to the Mexican border, but the agents had no physical evidence, so they interviewed David a few times and eventually dismissed the case. However, the dismissal changed everything because Jessie went from trying to stop him to accepting that nothing she said or anyone she trusted could pull him out of what he was doing, and instead of resisting, she folded back into his world and became one of his closest accomplices. Then there was Cindy Hendy, who arrived in New Mexico in 1998 after fleeing assault and drug-related charges in Washington, and she settled in Elephant Butte. She met Jessie and Jessie's boyfriend Roy, and the 3 of them started a relationship that revolved around partying, drinking, and a sense of freedom Cindy didn't have in her old life. But when Cindy met David, her loyalty shifted quickly because he gave her structure, attention, and a role in something she didn't fully understand at first, but embraced without much hesitation. She became his girlfriend within months, and she absorbed his ideology the same way Jessie had years earlier, and soon she was helping restrain victims, assisting with abductions, and participating in sessions. When Cynthia escaped, Cindy tried to stop her by smashing a glass lamp over her head, and after she was arrested, she eventually told investigators that David had unalived as many as 14 women and disposed of their bodies around the Southwest, though no bodies were ever found to confirm those numbers. The third accomplice was Roy Yancey, a friend of Ray who moved in and out of Jessie's life and became involved in Ray's crimes through a combination of proximity and influence, and he later admitted that he played a role in one of the few deaths that investigators could partially track. However, long before Cynthia ran down that road, David Parker Ray had already refined a system that allowed him to kidnap women without drawing attention, and he relied on a combination of manipulation, opportunity, and the help of the people closest to him. Once a woman was in the camper, the next step was sedation, and Ray had spent years perfecting that part. He used powerful sedatives that created confusion and long-term memory gaps because they made victims easier to control and easier to release later. He told one survivor that the drugs were part of his safe disposal plan, and he gave the same explanation on the tape he played for every new captive, which he recorded in 1993 and updated when necessary. And when he decided a victim's time was up, he moved to the release procedure, which was something he spoke about often, almost proudly, because he believed it made him efficient and harder to catch. He washed the woman thoroughly so no DNA remained, flushed her vaginal and rectal cavities, cleaned her hair, trimmed her nails if necessary, and sedated her with heavy doses of strong sedatives designed to erase memory and leave her confused for days. Then he drove her to a quiet stretch of road and left her there disoriented, but alive, so she would either doubt what happened or be too embarrassed or terrified to report it. One of his victims was Kelly Van Cleve, who had gone out with friends near Truth or Consequences, and she didn't drink much that night because she had planned to drive home, but she suddenly felt far more intoxicated than one beer could explain. Jessie Ray, her supposed friend, used that moment to convince her that she was too impaired to drive and should come stay at her father's place. Kelly trusted her enough to agree, and the next thing she remembered was the cold pressure of handcuffs closing around her wrists as she lay on a couch in David's trailer, and then a metal collar tightening around her neck before she was dragged into the toy box. She woke up strapped to the gynecological table, spread open under the ceiling mirror, and the tape began playing beside her with the same flat introduction. She screamed, but there was no one outside to hear her, and she drifted in and out as Ray her with clamps, penetrative devices, and shocks, and when she panicked too hard, he injected phenobarbital to dull her memory. When Kelly opened her eyes again, she wasn't in the trailer. She was sitting inside a McDonald's across from Ray, and he calmly told her that he had found her wandering on the beach and brought her somewhere safe. She didn't remember enough to argue. When she arrived home bruised and disoriented, her husband didn't believe anything she tried to piece together, and instead, he interpreted her story as an excuse for being gone for days, so he filed for divorce and told her to leave. Kelly carried that confusion for years until she turned on the news in 1999 and saw David Parker Ray's face, and when investigators played a VHS tape found inside the toy box, she watched her own body strapped to the table with her distinctive tattoo visible, and the memories she had buried forced their way back. Another of his victims was Marie Parker. Marie Parker had struggled on and off with addiction and work, and her life had been chaotic enough that local police didn't pay much attention when she disappeared, and this made her especially vulnerable around Ray's circle. She knew Jessie Ray from the bar scene, and after she lost her apartment, Jessie offered to let her stay in a tent on her father's property. A few days after, Jessie and her boyfriend Roy Yancey picked up Marie under the pretense of getting drugs, and once they reached an isolated area, Jessie pulled a gun and handcuffed her before driving her straight to Elephant Butte. According to Roy's later confession, Jessie delivered Marie to the toy box where both she and Ray her over 3 days, using the same devices he used on every victim. Roy said Ray handed him a rope and ordered him to strangle Marie, and he did, and afterward they wrapped her body in a blue blanket and drove to Monticello Canyon where they rolled her into a ravine and covered her with loose dirt. Search teams later combed the canyon, but the body was never recovered, so nothing could be proven against Ray or Jessie despite Roy's admission. Also, Angelica Montano's story began with something as ordinary as wanting to bake a cake for her boyfriend, and she didn't have the ingredients, so Cindy Hendy offered to give her some cake mix if she came by. Angelica trusted her because they were friends, but when she arrived, David suddenly stepped out with a knife, and Cindy pressed a gun to her head while they stripped her and locked a metal collar around her neck before chaining her inside the trailer. She spent more than 3 days naked on a bed, unable to move, and when Ray finally took her to the toy box, he her for about an hour until he looked at his watch, realized his television show was starting, and stopped simply because he didn't want to miss it. He forced her to perform oral before taking her back to the house, and Angelica used the little control she had left to convince them that she enjoyed it, hoping it would make them release her. It worked, and the next day they dropped her off at a bus station without sedating her. Angelica flagged down Officer Gary Leba, an off-duty officer, and told him everything, but she panicked when he offered to take her to the police station near Elephant Butte because she feared Ray would find her, so she refused and disappeared back to Albuquerque. She told her father what happened, and the two of them planned to drive to Elephant Butte to kill Ray, but her father was murdered in a drug deal before they could act, and the plan died with him. Angelica only came forward after Ray's arrest, once she realized she wasn't the only one. After Cynthia's escape, the investigation expanded faster than any agency expected because every hour revealed something that forced detectives to widen the perimeter, and the more they uncovered inside the trailer, the more they suspected that Cynthia wasn't just a single victim, but the last in a long line of women who had gone missing without anyone understanding why. So federal agents, state police, and local investigators converged on Elephant Butte Lake, and they all worked under the growing belief that Ray had been abducting women for years and disposing of bodies somewhere in the surrounding area. Several search was made around Elephant Butte to gather evidence on anything that might match Ray's rumored disposal methods, but Elephant Butte was enormous, and silt buried evidence quickly, and the water levels changed from season to season. So investigators had to accept that the lake itself was swallowing whatever secrets had been left there. Forensic teams later found a burlap sack containing small pieces of tissue and bone, and even though it was the closest thing to physical evidence of homicide, the remains were too degraded for identification, so no link could be made to Ray or any missing woman. This lack of direct proof frustrated investigators because it didn't match the scale of what they were cataloging inside the toy box in the house. Agents recovered more than 400 personal items, rings, necklaces, hair ties, clothing fragments, and small trinkets that Ray had kept in boxes and drawers like souvenirs, and when news outlets broadcast images of the items, several women called in to say they recognized something that once belonged to them, but most couldn't remember enough to give a complete account because the drugs had erased years of detail from their memories. As interviews continued, patterns began forming, and investigators estimated that Ray might have abducted 40 to 60 women based on his journals, the tapes, and the volume of personal effects, but none of it translated into murder charges because there were no confirmed bodies. Cindy Hendy told detectives that Ray had killed at least 14 women, and Roy Yancey claimed that Ray ordered him to strangle Marie Parker, but even with those confessions, prosecutors couldn't move forward without physical remains, and Ray knew that better than anyone because he had described his disposal method in disturbing detail in his personal writings. According to those notes, he would cut open a body, remove organs to prevent buoyancy, fill the cavity with cement, wrap the entire torso in tarps or wire mesh, and sink it into the deepest parts of the lake where it would drop into silt and become almost impossible to recover. Investigators believed he may have used multiple locations around Elephant Butte and the surrounding canyons, and because no one knew when he started killing or how often he disposed of a body, there was simply no clear timeline to reconstruct. Once investigators built the initial cases, the prosecutions moved forward, and the courts quickly realized they were dealing with something that was far larger and more complicated than a standard kidnapping trial, so the judge separated each victim's case to prevent the evidence from bleeding together. That decision immediately weakened the prosecution because it meant each woman's testimony had to stand alone, and the jury in one trial couldn't hear about the others, even though the patterns were identical. So when David Parker Ray went to trial for what he did to Kelly Van Cleve, the defense leaned heavily on that separation. They argued that Kelly's memories were unreliable, and they suggested she had consented to everything she experienced, even though the tape showing her bound and terrified existed in the evidence room. 2 jurors refused to convict, and the entire case collapsed into a mistrial, which stunned the prosecution because they knew the other women's testimonies would have supported Kelly's story if the jury had been allowed to hear them. The state retried him, and the second jury had no difficulty seeing the truth, so they found him guilty on all counts. However, even with that conviction secured, prosecutors knew the next trial would matter even more because Cynthia Vigil's case was the strongest of all. Her memories were intact, and the timeline was clear, and the DNA on the broken lamp matched her story, but that's not all. The physical injuries she carried into the hospital matched the she described. Also, there were witnesses who had seen her running for help, and there was no doubt she had escaped his house in chains. So the prosecution finally believed they had a case that could end Ray's freedom for the rest of his life. However, halfway through Cynthia's trial, Ray abruptly changed strategy and told his attorney to negotiate a plea deal, which surprised everyone because he had always insisted the inside the toy box was consensual. The agreement gave him 224 years in prison, and the deal ended the trials for Cynthia and Angelica without forcing them back onto the witness stand. There were rumors that Ray accepted the plea to protect his daughter Jessie from a harsher sentence, but the prosecutor publicly denied that, even though Jessie later served only about 3 years of a 9-year sentence for her role in Kelly's abduction. Cindy Hendy, who had become the state's most useful witness, continued cooperating, and she was sentenced to 36 years, though she was released on parole in 2019. Roy Yancey, who confessed to strangling Marie Parker on Ray's orders, served limited time as well, even though his confession provided the closest thing to a murder admission in the entire investigation. Ray, meanwhile, never faced a murder charge, and he never revealed where any bodies were buried. So when the time finally came for detectives to question him again, they hoped he would talk. But on May 28, 2002, only hours after he was moved to the Lee County Correctional Facility for interrogation, he collapsed from a heart attack and died at 62. That sudden death ended any remaining chance of recovering victims or closing the dozens of missing persons cases that investigators believed might be connected to him. So the official record closed without the one truth every survivor, investigator, and grieving family needed most. David Parker Ray died with the locations of his victims still inside him, and the toy box remained the only complete evidence of what he had done. Now we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have been done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one of them, and your voice truly matters. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real, in-depth, true crime stories. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourself.